In a quiet Vermont winter, a retired Navy SEAL saw something beneath an abandoned bus stop. A starving German shepherd lay curled in the snow, guarding a scrap of blue wool like it was all she had left. Ethan Crowley took her home, fed her, warmed her, and gave her the name Vesper. But every night she kept staring at the door, as if someone out there still needed her. When Ethan followed her back into the storm, she led him to a row of dark cottages where elderly neighbors had vanished behind polite paperwork. What he found there was not just a broken heating system, but a town that had forgotten who was waiting to come home. Tell us where you're watching from. Leave your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. By late afternoon, the snow had turned Alder Run, Vermont, into something almost kind. Almost. It softened the black branches of the maple trees, rounded the shoulders of old fences, and laid a clean white hand over every rusted mailbox along County 9. From a distance, a man might have mistaken the town for peaceful. Ethan Crowley knew better. Snow was not mercy. It only knew how to cover things. He drove his old dark green pickup slowly along the county road, one gloved hand resting loose on the wheel, the other near the heater vent that rattled whenever the truck hit a frost heave. At 53, Ethan still carried the frame of the man he had once been, 6 feet of hard-earned strength, broad shoulders, a chest built by years of discipline and weather rather than vanity. His face was clean-shaven, sharply cut, the jaw strong, the cheekbones hollowed slightly by time. His hair, brown once, now carried ash-gray at the temples, cut in a neat undercut that looked almost too controlled for a man who lived alone at the edge of the woods. People in Alder Run knew him, though few could claim to know him well. He was the man who repaired a sagging porch before the owner could ask twice, the man who pulled a widow's sedan from a ditch and left before she could bring out coffee, the man who stacked firewood for old Mr. Hadley, then pretended not to hear the invitation to supper. He had not left life completely. That would have been easier to name. He simply kept himself on the edge of it, like a figure standing outside a warm window, refusing to knock. That morning, he had patched a shed roof where ice had torn loose a strip of tin. By noon, he had helped a couple on Maple Ridge restart a dead generator. After that, he had cleared the walk in front of the old post office because the new clerk had a bad hip and too much pride. His hands had stayed useful. His heart, as far as he was concerned, could remain unemployed. The cabin waited for him beyond the next bend, tucked against the maple woods. There would be a low fire in the stove if the draft had held. There would be coffee gone bitter in the pot. There would be silence, solid and familiar, sitting in its usual chair. Then he saw the bus stop. It stood beside County 9 like something the town had forgotten to finish burying. The route had been canceled years ago, leaving behind a narrow shelter with a bowed tin roof, a faded schedule board, and a wooden bench split down the middle, like an old back that had carried too many winters. Snow had piled against one side. A torn advertisement for a church supper, 3 years out of date, still fluttered under the cracked plastic frame. Ethan would have driven past it. He had driven past it hundreds of times. But something dark moved beneath the bench. He eased the truck onto the shoulder. For a moment, he only sat there, engine ticking, wipers dragging half-frozen arcs across the windshield. The figure under the bench did not move again. It might have been a trash bag, a coat, some poor animal already past needing help. Ethan turned off the engine. The cold entered the cab before he opened the door, as if it had been waiting with its hand on the latch. He stepped into ankle-deep snow, boots crunching, canvas coat creaking at the shoulders. Beneath it, he wore the olive-drab combat shirt he still reached for too often without thinking, its camouflage sleeves marked by pale horizontal bands around the upper arms. Not a uniform anymore, just cloth, just habit, just one more thing he had never learned to put away. He approached the shelter slowly. "Easy," he said, though he was not sure whether he meant the animal or himself. The shape under the bench lifted its head. A German shepherd. Female, he thought at once. yellow and black, though the colors had been dulled by hunger, wet snow, and hard days. Her dark saddle was still visible along her back, but her ribs showed beneath the winter-thick coat. One ear stood straight, the other bent slightly at the tip, not naturally, but from an old injury. Her muzzle was black, silvered faintly near the chin. Her eyes were the thing that stopped him. Amber, deep, watchful, not begging. That was worse. She lay curled on a scrap of dark blue wool, her front paws tucked beneath her chest, the posture of an animal trying to become smaller than suffering. A thin scar crossed near one foreleg. Snow clung to the long fur of her tail. When Ethan crouched, she did not growl. She did not wag. She simply looked at him as if deciding whether humans had one more disappointment left in them. "Yeah?" Ethan murmured. "Fair." He removed one glove and held out the back of his hand. Not too close, not demanding. His fingers went numb almost immediately. The shepherd watched him for a long while. A truck passed on the road behind him, tires hissing through slush. The dog flinched, but only slightly. Ethan glanced toward the empty schedule board. No bus had stopped here in years. Still, beneath that useless roof, this dog had waited as if some part of the world remained obligated to return. Something tightened under his ribs. He looked away first. "Come on," he said quietly, "before we both freeze out here trying to look dignified." The shepherd did not move. Ethan returned to the truck, took the old wool blanket from behind the seat, and came back. When he unfolded it, the dog's eyes tracked every motion. He did not reach for her collar. There was no collar. Only a faint ring in the fur where one had been. He set the blanket beside her. "Your choice." The wind pushed snow under the shelter, scattering it over his boots. Ethan waited. He had waited in worse places, for worse reasons. Waiting beside a starving dog under a dead bus route should have been simple. It was not. At last, the shepherd stretched her nose toward the blanket. She sniffed it, then looked up at him. Not trust, not yet, but not refusal. Ethan slid one hand beneath the blanket's edge and guided it around her body. She stiffened, trembling so hard he felt it through the wool. When he lifted her, she made one broken sound deep in her throat, not a cry, not a warning. A protest from an animal who had endured too much to enjoy being carried, even kindly. "I know," he said. "I wouldn't trust me either." He placed her on the passenger floor of the truck, where the heater could reach her without blasting directly into her face. The piece of blue wool came with her. She would not let it go. Her teeth closed around one corner, weak but determined. Ethan looked at it and felt, without wanting to, that the scrap mattered. On the drive home, she kept her head low and her eyes open. Every time the truck passed a driveway, every time the road curved, she lifted her gaze toward the window, not searching for escape, searching for recognition. His cabin came into view between the maples, warm light glowing through the front windows. Smoke rose from the chimney and bent east under the wind. It was a good cabin, built strong, kept clean, stocked well enough for any storm. A man could survive there. Surviving, Ethan had learned, was not the same thing as living. Inside, the dog hesitated at the threshold. Heat rolled out, pine smoke, old coffee, leather, iron tools on the kitchen table. Ethan stepped back, giving her room. She limped in, one paw barely touching the floor, still holding the blue wool scrap in her mouth. He fed her slowly. A little warm broth first, then soft food in small amounts. She ate with the careful discipline of an animal who had learned that hunger could punish greed. When he reached toward her injured foreleg, she froze, eyes flicking to his face. "Just looking," he said. His voice sounded strange in the cabin. He used it so rarely after dark that even the walls seemed to listen. He cleaned the cut near her leg, wrapped it lightly, and found no deep injury. Exhaustion, hunger, exposure, old scars, new fear, those were harder to bandage. By the stove, she finally lay down on the blanket he had spread for her. The blue wool scrap remained beneath her chin. Ethan stood over her for a moment, then glanced toward the mantel. A small brass hook held his keys. From them hung a little worn charm shaped like a musical note. Maribel's. She had bought it at a churchcraft sale years ago and laughed when he called it impractical. "Good," she had said. "You own too many practical things." He had never removed it. The dog's eyes followed his hand as he touched the charm with his thumb. "You need a name," he said. She blinked slowly. Outside, evening pressed blue against the windows, the hour between day and dark. Maribel had loved that hour. She said it made the world humble. "Vesper," Ethan said at last. The dog did not respond to it, of course. Names took time. Trust took longer. But when he said it again, softer, her one bent ear twitched. "Vesper," he repeated. "All right, then." For 2 nights she stayed. She ate, she drank, she slept in fragments. Whenever the fire shifted or the wind tapped the eaves, her head came up. Ethan pretended not to notice how often he woke to check if she was breathing. He told himself it was practical. A sick animal needed monitoring. On the 3rd evening, while snow began falling again in fine silver dust, Vesper rose from her blanket and walked to the door. Ethan looked up from the small notebook where he had been listing repairs for the week. "No?" She stood with her nose near the crack beneath the door. "You heard me." Vesper looked back. It was not pleading. That would have been easier to resist. It was expectation, patient, solemn, almost ancient, as if she had mistaken him for the kind of man who still answered when life called. Ethan closed the notebook. "Dog," he said, "I am not wandering Vermont after dark because you miss a snowbank." Her tail did not move. 10 minutes later, he was putting on his boots. The old gods, if they existed, must have enjoyed that kind of joke. A former Navy SEAL beaten not by enemy fire or winter roads, but by a half-starved shepherd with one crooked ear and the moral authority of a disappointed grandmother. Vesper led him down the track, then along County 9. The night was bright with snowlight, clouds covered the moon, yet the world glowed pale blue, every tree edged in white. Ethan carried a flashlight but rarely used it. Vesper moved slowly, conserving strength, stopping twice to rest. Each time he almost turned back. Each time she rose before he could speak. At the bus stop, she went straight beneath the shelter. Then she sat, exactly where he had found her. Ethan stood in the road, breath smoking, and watched her face the empty lane. No bus came, no headlights appeared, no door opened with a sigh of brakes. Only snow moved through the yellow cone of the old shelter light, which flickered as if embarrassed to still be working. "Vesper," he said. She did not turn. Something inside Ethan shifted, not breaking, not healing, just moving enough to hurt. He had done this too. Not under a bus shelter, not with snow gathering on his back, but in rooms where Maribel's sweater still hung on a chair. In the grocery aisle, where he still avoided the tea she liked, beside a phone that would never ring with her name again. He had waited in ways no one could see, and because no one saw, he had called it strength. Vesper was more honest. She sat in the open with her grief. Ethan swallowed hard. "She isn't coming back," he whispered, and only after the words left him did he realize he was not speaking only to the dog. The shepherd's left ear dipped in the wind. He rubbed a hand over his face, angry suddenly at the cold, at the dark, at the foolish mercy of animals, at the musical note charm resting against his chest beneath the coat. "Come on," he said, but his voice had lost its command. Vesper stood. For one hopeful second, he thought she would head home. Instead, she stepped behind the shelter, through a gap in the snowbank, onto a narrow path half hidden between young maples. After a few paces, she stopped and looked back at him. Ethan knew that path. He had not taken it in years. It led toward Alder Cottages. The name alone brought back a room full of folding chairs, old hymnals stacked on a piano, Maribel laughing as she taught half a dozen elderly residents to sing harmony even when one of them insisted harmony was a conspiracy against melody. Every Thursday she had gone there with sheet music under one arm and cookies under the other. After she died, the residents had held a small memorial. Ethan had not gone. He told himself grief made men unreliable. The truth was uglier. Their kindness had frightened him. He had not known what to do with people who loved the woman he lost and still had room to pity him. Vesper waited on the path. Snow gathered along her back. Her amber eyes held no accusation, which somehow made them harder to meet. "You don't know what you're asking," Ethan said. The dog turned and continued walking. He followed. The cottages appeared gradually through the trees, small pale houses huddled in a crescent beyond a split-rail fence. Their roofs were heavy with snow. Their windows were dark. No porch lamps burned, no smoke rose, no music drifted from the old community room. At the entrance, a new sign hung from the gate, white with black letters, too clean for the weather. Closed for emergency heating repairs. Ethan stood still. Vesper moved to the fence and lowered her nose to the snow. There were tracks there, not fresh human tracks, hers, many of them, a path worn by returning. No work trucks sat inside, no ladders, no stacked pipe, no footprints from repairmen moving between cottages. Only silence. And the dog, who had come back again and again to a place emptied of the people she loved. Ethan looked past the sign toward the dark windows, and for the first time in years, the quiet around him did not feel like shelter. It felt like something locked from the outside. Ethan did not open the gate at first. He stood before it with one hand on the cold metal latch, reading the sign again, though the words had already settled unpleasantly in his mind. Closed for emergency heating repairs. The letters were printed in black, clean and official, on a laminated white board tied to the gate with new zip ties. It was the kind of sign made to stop questions before they formed. Safety, emergency, repairs. Words with hard hats on. Beyond the gate, alder cottages sat in a shallow crescent beneath the snow. In daylight, Ethan remembered, the place used to look almost cheerful, painted in patient old colors, cream, pale blue, butter yellow, weathered green. Now, under the winter night, the houses seemed to be holding their breath. Vesper slipped through the gap beside the gate before Ethan could stop her. "Of course," he muttered. He opened the latch and followed. The snow inside the fence was uneven. Some of it had drifted smooth against the porches, but other parts had been broken by paw prints. Vesper's prints mostly. Small circles of returning, crossing the same paths again and again until the snow had packed down into ghost trails. There were no boot tracks from workers, no sled marks from hauled equipment, no tire ruts near the maintenance shed. The cottages looked less repaired than abandoned in the middle of being lived in. On one porch, a pair of green rubber boots stood beside the door, one upright, one fallen over as if it had fainted from waiting. On another, a watering can had frozen solid, its spout aimed toward a dead pot of geraniums. A folding chair lay on its side near Cottage 3, half buried under powder, the seat webbing sagging beneath ice. Ethan moved slowly, not touching anything more than he had to. Old habits did not vanish just because the battlefield changed shape. He noticed angles, absence, disturbance. The wrongness here was quiet, but it had structure. Vesper moved from porch to porch. She pressed her nose to one door, then another. At Cottage 2, she stood on the bottom step and gave a low sound, not quite a whine. At Cottage 4, she scratched once at the doorframe, then stopped, as if remembering she had already tried that and been refused by wood. Her left ear bent deeper in the cold. "Vesper," Ethan said gently. The dog ignored him. Not disobedience. Duty. She reached Cottage 6 and stopped. The cottage was painted a pale blue that looked gray beneath the snowlight. A small metal bird hung beside the door, turning slightly in the wind. The porch had been swept once, badly, then left for the next storm to undo. Through the front window, Ethan saw a curtain pulled halfway off its rod. A wicker basket lay tipped near an armchair. Dark fabric had spilled across the floor. Vesper climbed the steps and lowered herself near the door. Not sitting, not waiting exactly. Guarding. Ethan stepped closer and looked through the glass. A sewing lamp stood on a table, unplugged. A few squares of fabric rested beneath it, navy, faded gold, deep green, and a blue so dark it nearly matched the scrap Vesper had carried from the bus stop. A cup sat beside the lamp. A book lay open, face down, as if someone had stepped away for a minute and meant to return before the page cooled. The cold worked under Ethan's coat. He had seen empty rooms before. Some were empty because life had moved on, some because death had passed through. This one felt different. This room had been interrupted. He looked down at Vesper. Her amber eyes were fixed on the door. "You know this one," he said. Her tail shifted once against the porch boards. The sound was so small he almost missed it. Ethan did not break in. He wanted to. That surprised him. Want was a dangerous little animal. Once fed, it asked for more. He stepped back instead, memorizing the cottage number, the position of the curtain, the fabric on the floor. Then he led Vesper out through the gate. She resisted at first, planting her paws in the snow. He did not pull hard. He only waited until she looked at him. "I saw it," he said. "I'm not pretending I didn't." The dog held his gaze for a long moment. Then she came. Morning arrived bright enough to make the previous night seem theatrical. Alder Run wore sunlight like borrowed courage. Snow glittered from roof lines. Smoke climbed from chimneys. The mountains beyond town stood blue and white under a sky so clean it looked freshly made. Ethan drove in with Vesper on the passenger floor, her blue wool scrap beneath her chin and her eyes scanning every building they passed. He had meant to leave her at the cabin. She had disagreed without moving from the truck. The Maple Lantern sat near the center of town, squeezed between the hardware store and a narrow office that had once been a barber shop, then a tax service, and now appeared to be nothing but a place where old signs went to lose hope. The diner windows glowed gold against the cold. Inside, Ethan could see hats, shoulders, steam rising from mugs. He almost kept driving. Vesper lifted her head. "All right," he said. "But if anyone offers you bacon, you're on your own morally." The bell over the diner door rang when Ethan stepped in. Conversation did not stop, but it changed texture. Alder Run was polite enough not to stare openly, and small enough that everyone knew exactly whom they were pretending not to notice. The Maple Lantern smelled of coffee, buttered toast, cinnamon, and wet wool. Along the counter sat road workers in orange jackets, 2 women from the post office, and a man in a red plaid coat telling a story with more hand gestures than plot. Behind the counter, June Bellows, the owner, looked up from pouring coffee. She was a square-shouldered woman in her early 60s, silver hair pinned back with a pencil, face built for both kindness and refusing nonsense. "Ethan Crowley," she said, "either my roof is about to fall in or the world has changed." "Morning, June." That didn't answer me. World's still undecided. She looked past him and saw Vesper standing close to his leg, thin but alert. June's expression softened before she could hide it. "Well," she said, reaching for a mug, "that explains at least half the miracle." Ethan took a stool at the end of the counter, where his back could stay near the wall. Vesper lay down beneath him, not relaxed, but willing to be still. When June set coffee in front of him, she added a small bowl of water on the floor without asking. "I need to ask about Alder Cottages," Ethan said. That did stop one conversation. Not all of them, just enough. June wiped the counter, though it was already clean. "Heating repairs." "So I read." Malcolm Strayhorn said the old system was unsafe. Folks were moved out temporary. "Temporary has a date?" June's eyes flicked to the road workers, then back. "You'd have to ask the town office." One of the men at the far table turned. "Strayhorn's done more than most would, paid for rooms over at Holloway Lodge, sent heaters to the church basement. Bought coffee for the plow crews last week." "That right," Ethan said. "Just saying," the man replied, less defensive than tired. "Hard winter, old buildings. Nobody wants folks freezing because somebody got sentimental about cottages." Vesper's head rose beneath the counter, not at the man's voice, at a name spoken by someone near the door. "Miss V?" An old man had come in with a gust of cold and a wool cap pulled low over thick white hair. He stood with one hand still on the door, staring down at the dog. His navy coat was faded at the elbows, and a small metal ticket punch hung from a chain at his vest pocket, polished by years of fingers. He had the weathered face of a man who had watched many roads disappear behind him. Vesper stood. The change in her was immediate and total. Her body remained thin, her legs still careful, but some hidden lamp inside her flared. She took 2 steps forward, stopped, then lowered her head as if unsure whether memory could be trusted. The old man's face folded. "Well, I'll be," he whispered. "Brown eyes." Vesper walked to him then. He crouched with difficulty, one knee protesting loudly enough to deserve its own sermon, and held out both hands. Vesper pressed her muzzle into them. The man closed his eyes. The diner had gone quiet in a way coffee shops rarely managed. Ethan stood. "You know her?" The old man looked up. His eyes were pale blue, watery from age and cold, but sharp behind it. "Know her? I used to save her half my sandwich on Tuesdays. Don't tell my doctor, or my wife. One of them can still hurt me." A few people laughed softly, grateful for permission. "Theo Larkin," June said to Ethan, "drove the old county bus route before they cut it." Theo scratched behind Vesper's ear, finding the spot without hesitation. This one had more names than a bootlegger. Miss V from me. Brown Eyes from Mrs. Cafferty. Lady from Mr. Hollis, because he said every respectable stop needed one. Elsie called her something else when she stole thread. Vesper leaned into his hand. Ethan felt the room shift around that simple fact. The dog was not a stray discovered under a bus bench. Not exactly. She had been known, fed, teased, scolded, expected, belonged. "What happened to the cottages?" Ethan asked. Theo rose slowly, using the edge of the counter. Humor faded from his face, not gone, but put away with care. "Depends who you ask." "I'm asking you?" June poured Theo coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug, but did not drink. "Route used to run County 9 3 days a week," Theo said. "Picked up the alder folks for groceries, clinic appointments, church suppers, whatever needed doing. Didn't make money, but not everything worth keeping does." Then the town shifted funds. Winter tourism shuttle got priority. Bigger promise, better brochures. Who pushed it? Theo looked toward the window where sunlight flashed off parked cars. Malcolm Strayhorn was on every committee without being on any committee. You know the type. A man who doesn't hold the rope but tells everyone where to pull. The road worker at the far table muttered, "He kept the lodge open last storm." Theo nodded. "He did?" Credit where it's due, but good deeds don't turn a man transparent. Ethan took that in. Vesper had settled at Theo's feet now, not asleep, only listening with her body. Each time Theo said a name, her ears moved. Mrs. Cafferty, Hollis, Elsie, names falling into the room like small pieces of kindling. Theo's voice lowered. Once the bus stopped, those cottages got easier to call inconvenient. Folks missed appointments, needed rides, relied on neighbors. Then came the heating notices. Temporary relocation, they said. Safety issue, they said. Malcolm handled it kindly, everybody said. You don't believe that? I believe kindness gets advertised louder when someone needs cover. June made a small sound under her breath. Maybe agreement, maybe fear. Ethan looked around the diner. No one seemed shocked. That was worse. Shock meant the truth was new. This felt like something people had been walking around, careful not to step directly on it. Where did they go? Ethan asked. Scattered, Theo said. Holloway Lodge, relatives. A care place over in Stowe for a few. Some temporary apartments, if you can call them that, without insulting walls. And Cottage 6? Theo's fingers tightened around the mug. Elsie Moran. At the name, Vesper's head snapped up. Not lifted. Snapped. The blue scrap of wool slid from her mouth and fell at Ethan's boot. Her whole body seemed suddenly awake, as if a match had been struck beneath her ribs. She stared at Theo, ears uneven, eyes burning with a recognition too large for her thin frame. Theo saw it. His own eyes grew wet. "Still listening for her, are you?" he said softly. Vesper took one step toward the door. Ethan bent and picked up the wool scrap. He rubbed it between his fingers, feeling the worn weave, the faint smell of smoke, old fabric, and something like lavender. Theo watched him. "Elsie was the seamstress," he said. "Cottage 6, little woman, big opinions, made quilts for half the valley, and corrected the Lord's grammar and hymns. She took sick after the move. Pneumonia, they said. Just got out of the hospital." "Where is she?" "Staying with a cousin south of town. Not happily, I imagine. Elsie never did like being stored." June looked at Ethan over the coffee pot. "Careful, Ethan." He met her eyes. She did not look afraid of Malcolm exactly. It was a smaller, more common fear, the fear of causing trouble in a place where everyone had to see everyone again tomorrow. "Just asking questions," Ethan said. "That's how trouble learns your name." Theo gave a dry chuckle. "Trouble already knows his name. Probably has it filed under Difficult Quiet Owns Tools." For the first time that morning, one corner of Ethan's mouth almost moved. Almost. He looked down at Vesper. The dog had not taken her eyes off the door. Alder Run continued outside as if nothing had changed. Cars rolled by. Snow slid from the hardware store awning. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. The town looked bright, functional, innocent. But Ethan thought of the dark cottages, the frozen watering can, the open book inside Cottage 6, and the paw tracks worn into the snow by a dog who had gone back again and again because no one else had. He placed a few bills on the counter. June frowned. "Coffee's on me." It wasn't for the coffee. She looked at the money, then at Vesper, and understood. She said nothing. Theo reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook, its cover softened by years in a pocket. He tore a page from the back and wrote an address in careful block letters. "Elsie's cousin," he said, sliding it across the counter. "Roads plowed badly after the White Barn. Don't trust the second turn. It lies." "Roads don't lie," Ethan said. Theo put his ticket punch back into his pocket. "Spoken like a man who never drove County 9 with 6 church ladies, 3 pies, and a Labrador throwing up near the rear heater." This time Ethan did smile, though it arrived tired and left quickly. Vesper stood before he did. At the door, she paused and looked back at Theo. The old driver lifted 2 fingers in a small salute. "Go on then, Miss V," he said. "Find your seamstress." Outside, the air was sharp and full of light. Ethan opened the truck door, and Vesper climbed in slowly, guarding her strength. Before he started the engine, he unfolded Theo's note and read the address again. Elsie Moran. The name sat on the paper like a door. Ethan glanced toward the road south of town. He had begun the morning looking for an explanation. Now he understood he was looking for a witness. And maybe, though he did not like the thought, Vesper was not the only one being led back to someone who had been waiting. The address Theo Larkin had written led Ethan south of town, past the White Barn he had warned about, and beyond the second turn that did, in fact, lie. The road curved one way, while the snowbank suggested another, and for a moment Ethan understood why Theo had treated geography as a moral hazard. Vesper stood with her front paws braced against the passenger seat, thin body tense, eyes fixed through the windshield. She had not settled since they left the Maple Lantern. Every mile south seemed to pull some invisible thread tighter inside her. "Easy," Ethan said. Vesper did not look at him. The house where Elsie Moran was staying sat behind a row of dark spruce trees, neat and square, painted white with green shutters. It was not unkind looking. Smoke rose from the chimney. The walk had been shoveled. A red wreath hung on the door, slightly too perfect, as if someone had bought it to prove warmth could be arranged from outside. A younger woman opened before Ethan knocked twice. She was in her 40s, narrow-faced, with tired eyes and a cardigan buttoned wrong at the middle. Her name was Ruth Ann, she said, Elsie's cousin's daughter, though she delivered the relation with the exhausted precision of someone who had explained it too often. When she saw Vesper, something moved across her face. Sympathy first, then worry. "She shouldn't get excited," Ruth Ann said. "The doctor said rest." "I can leave." But from somewhere inside the house came a thin voice, dry as paper and sharp as a needle. "If that man brought the dog all this way, and you send them off the porch, Ruth Ann, I will haunt your soup." Ruth Ann closed her eyes. "Aunt Elsie." "I heard a truck. I heard paws. I am old, not decorative." Ethan almost smiled. Ruth Ann stepped aside. The front room was clean, warm, and entirely wrong for the woman sitting in it. Ethan knew that before Elsie Moran said a word. There was nothing cruel about the place. A lamp with a beige shade, family photographs, a couch covered in plastic no one admitted was plastic, a shelf of ceramic birds. Yet Elsie seemed placed there rather than living there, like a teacup set on the wrong saucer. She sat in an armchair near the window, small enough that the blanket over her knees nearly swallowed her. Her white hair was twisted into a low bun, though several strands had escaped near her temples. Her shoulders bent forward, not from defeat exactly, but from decades of leaning over fabric, listening to cloth tell her where it wished to be joined. Her hands rested on the blanket, thin and veined, the fingers slightly crooked. They did not look weak to Ethan. They looked precise. Vesper stopped in the doorway. For the first time since Ethan had found her under the bus shelter, the shepherd did not calculate the room. She did not check corners, doors, escape routes. She made one small sound from deep in her chest and walked forward. Elsie's face changed. It did not become young, nothing so simple, but something lit behind her eyes, a lamp in a house everyone had called empty. "Well," she whispered, "there you are." Vesper reached her and lowered her head onto Elsie's knees. The old woman's hand came down slowly, trembling once before it touched the dog's bent left ear. Vesper closed her eyes. Not the half-sleep she had allowed by Ethan's stove, not the vigilant pause of an animal saving strength. This was surrender. Elsie bent over her, forehead nearly touching the dog's skull. "You still waited," she said. "Of course you did. Foolish, faithful girl." Ruth Ann turned toward the kitchen quickly, pretending to check something that did not need checking. Ethan stood near the door and felt like an intruder at a reunion, older than his understanding. Elsie stroked Vesper's ear again, her thumb finding the injured tip with the exact tenderness of someone who remembered the wound's story. "She used to steal thread," she said, voice still low. "Not chew it, steal it. Carried the spool under Mr. Hollis's porch and looked offended when accused." Vesper sighed into her lap. "She has a name now," Ethan said. "Vesper." Elsie tasted it silently. "Evening prayer. That suits her, though Mrs. Cafferty would object. She insisted this dog was too nosy for anything holy." The corner of Ethan's mouth moved. Elsie noticed. Her eyes were pale blue-gray, tired, but unblurred. "You're Ethan Crowley." He had expected it, but the sound of his name in that room still landed strangely. "Yes, ma'am." Maribel's Ethan. That was different. For years, people had placed his service before him, like a rank he could not resign. Former SEAL, Navy man, the quiet one with the truck. Elsie named him by the woman he had loved, and the room seemed to change its laws. He looked down. Elsie did not apologize. Old women who had survived winter, widowhood, rent increases, and hymn committees did not apologize for naming the truth. "Sit," she said. "I'm fine." "You look like every man who says that before falling through a floorboard. Sit." He sat. Ruth Ann brought tea for Elsie and coffee for Ethan. The coffee was thin enough to make him miss his own bitter pot, but he drank it because refusing would have created more conversation than accepting. Vesper stayed pressed against Elsie's chair as if guarding the only warm country left on earth. Ethan explained where he had found her. The bus stop, the blue scrap of wool, the cottages, cottage 6. He kept the account plain, trimming emotion the way he trimmed a damaged board. Remove what might splinter, leave only what holds. Elsie listened without interrupting. When he mentioned the sign on the gate, her hand stilled on Vesper's head. "Emergency heating repairs," she said. "That's what it says." Oh, the heat was old? Elsie looked toward the window, where snow rested along the sill. Pipes knocked. Furnace grumbled like a Baptist at bingo. But old is not the same as deadly. If it were, half this town would have been evacuated years ago. Ruth Ann made a small choking sound from the kitchen. Elsie ignored it. "Malcolm Strayhorn sent a man with a clipboard," she continued. "Young fellow, polite enough to make you check for missing silver. He said the system could fail in the next deep cold. Said there were liability concerns. Said temporary relocation. That word temporary can stretch like cheap elastic." "How long ago?" 3 weeks before Christmas. Ethan did the math. Nearly 2 months. Elsie's mouth tightened. First it was 10 days, then 2 weeks, then after New Year's, then pending inspection, then pending contractor availability. A person can grow old waiting for people to finish being pending. She reached to the small table beside her chair and picked up a folded sheet from beneath her glasses. Her hand shook, but not from uncertainty. She passed it to Ethan. It was a notice addressed to the residents of Alder Cottages. Clean language, safety concern, temporary relocation, cooperation appreciated, support provided. At the bottom, Malcolm Strayhorn's printed signature sat above a company seal Ethan did not recognize. "He moved you all out with this?" "With that, and with vans, and with men who kept saying it was for our own good." Elsie's voice did not rise. "That is a powerful phrase when spoken to old people. For your own good. It turns every objection into proof that you are confused." Ethan looked at the paper again. Nothing about it shouted. That made it uglier. "Did anyone call the town office?" "Some did. Marin Pike said the paperwork had been filed. She sounded unsure, which is not the same as unkind. But unsure people in offices can still become doors that do not open." Vesper lifted her head slightly at Elsie's tone. The old woman softened at once. No, I'm not angry now." Vesper did not appear convinced. Elsie sighed. "Well, perhaps a little." She reached beside her chair and pulled up a cloth bag, faded green, patched at the bottom. From it, she drew a folded quilt square, then another, then a small bundle of fabric tied with blue thread. The room seemed to grow quieter with each piece. "I made memory quilts," she said. "Not fancy art. Practical things. Warm things. Every cottage had someone afraid of losing something. A photograph, a rent paper, a prescription list, a letter from a son who wrote badly but faithfully. So I made pockets in the linings. Hidden, but not secret. There is a difference." She unfolded one square across her lap. Its fabric had been cut from old shirts, flannel, cotton, a faded print of yellow flowers. Along one edge was a narrow inner pocket, closed with 2 small stitches. Mrs. Cafferty kept her husband's last grocery list in hers. Not romantic to most people. To her, it proved he remembered the cinnamon. She unfolded another, dark wool, a patch of green, a corner embroidered with the initials HL. Mr. Hollis kept bus tickets, said the dates reminded him of places his knees no longer allowed him to visit. Ethan said nothing. His chest had begun to feel too tight. Elsie looked at him over the quilt. "People think old age makes a person own less. It does not. It makes every small thing heavier." The words stayed in the room. Then Ruth Ann came from the kitchen carrying a cardboard box. "Aunt Elsie, maybe not all at once." "If I wanted a nurse, I'd have married one," Elsie said. "You did marry a mailman." "And he delivered bills with a nurse's level of authority." Ruth Ann gave Ethan a helpless look that was not entirely unhappy and set the box near the chair. Inside were more fabric bundles, a tin of buttons, and a pair of small silver scissors. Vesper rose. Slowly, almost reverently, the dog lowered her nose into the box and sniffed. Her body trembled, not with fear. Recognition moved through her like a bell tone. Elsie watched her. She guarded them, didn't she? Ethan thought of Cottage 6, the spilled cloth, the paw tracks worn in snow. I think so. She always knew which quilt belonged to which lap, Elsie said. When the bus came, she'd sit under the bench and wait for the right feet to get down. If Mr. Hollis stepped off without his cane, she'd bark once. If Mrs. Cafferty forgot her shopping bag, she'd block the aisle like a furry tax collector. Despite himself, Ethan gave a quiet breath of laughter. Vesper looked up, offended by the implication that public service deserved mockery. Elsie smiled at her. Then the smile faded. When they moved us, we were allowed one suitcase and bedding. That was the language. Bedding. Some took their quilts. Some panicked and forgot. Some had relatives packing for them who did not know what mattered. Mine were still in Cottage 6 when the fever got bad. Pneumonia, Ethan said, among other forms of being inconvenient. Ruth Ann lowered her eyes. Elsie did not accuse her. That was somehow kinder and worse. I tried to go back, Elsie said. They said the property was closed. Liability, safety, that word again. Safety can be a warm blanket or a locked gate, depending who holds it. Ethan looked at the box of fabric. These were not dramatic documents. No hidden map, no confession folded into silk. Just rent papers, prescriptions, names, bus tickets, grocery lists, the paperwork of ordinary lives. Yet he understood with sudden cold clarity that ordinary things were exactly what powerful men counted on others dismissing. Elsie reached into the box and lifted a small square of blue wool. Vesper stepped forward. The fabric matched the scrap from the bus stop. This was from my winter shawl, Elsie said. Tore it 2 winters ago on a nail by the community room. I cut it down for quilt binding. Vesper stole a piece. I let her keep it because I am merciful and weak. The dog pressed her nose to the wool. Ethan's throat tightened. The scrap was not random. It was not trash under a dead bus shelter. It was a piece of Elsie's world carried by a dog who had nothing else left to hold. Elsie looked at him then, and her voice changed. It became gentler, which made it harder to bear. Maribel loved that room. Ethan did not move. The old woman continued, not cruelly. She came every Thursday with sheet music and cookies. She could make Mr. Hollis sing on key by glaring at him. That was no small miracle. After she passed, we held a little service in the community room, sang the song she liked. Ethan looked toward the window. Snow had begun again, thin flakes drifting past the glass. I heard, he said, you did not come. No. Vesper had moved back to him without his noticing. She stood near his knee, close but not touching. Elsie waited. Ethan could have said he was sorry. It would have been true, but too small. He could have said he could not bear it. Also true, also small. Grief had made him selfish in ways he had called survival. I didn't know how to be around people who missed her too, he said. The sentence surprised him. It had not asked permission before leaving. Elsie's eyes softened. No, I suppose grief teaches a person poor manners. That did it. Not forgiveness, not judgment. Just an old woman allowing the truth to sit down without making it take off its boots. Ethan looked at Vesper, then at the quilts, then at the folded notice still in his hand. What do you want me to do? Elsie gave a short laugh. That is a dangerous question to ask a woman with a sewing box. I mean it. I know. She rested one hand on Vesper's head. I want my quilts. Not because they are evidence, though some fool may eventually discover they are useful. I want them because Mrs. Cafferty's cinnamon list is not Malcolm Strayhorn's property. Mr. Hollis's bus tickets are not a development obstacle, and my chair by the window is not a concept to be relocated. Ethan nodded once. I can help you get them back. Ruth Ann looked alarmed. The cottages are closed. I won't break in. Elsie raised one eyebrow. Former soldier says that with noticeable disappointment. Navy? Worse, boats make men dramatic. Vesper's tail moved once. Ethan almost smiled again, but the weight of the room held him steady. "I'll start by finding out who has authority over access," he said. "Town office, property manager, fire inspection records?" Elsie studied him. "You sound like a man trying very hard not to care." "I'm trying to be useful." "Same disease, different hat." He folded the notice carefully. "May I keep a copy?" Ruth Ann offered to make one. While she went to the small printer in the hall, Elsie leaned back, suddenly tired. The color had thinned in her face, but her eyes remained clear. Vesper laid her head on the arm of the chair. Elsie whispered something Ethan did not catch. Perhaps a name, perhaps several. When Ruth Ann returned with the copy, Ethan stood. He felt too large in the tidy room, too armored, too late. At the door, Elsie called after him. "Ethan," he turned. "If you go back to that place, do not go only for us." Her hand rested over Vesper's bent ear. "There are rooms that keep waiting for the living, too." He had no answer. Outside, the cold struck clean and sharp. Vesper climbed into the truck slowly, exhausted from recognition. Ethan sat behind the wheel and looked at the copied notice on his lap. Mary Bell's name had not been written anywhere on it. Still, somehow, the paper had brought him closer to her than he had allowed himself to stand in years. He started the engine. In the passenger seat, Vesper rested her muzzle on the blue wool scrap and closed her eyes. This time, she slept. Malcolm Strayhorn entered the Maple Lantern the way some men entered church, not humbly, but certain the room understood his importance. It was a bright morning after snowfall, the kind that made Alder Run look kinder than it was. Sunlight struck the diner windows and scattered across the counter in pale squares. Boots steamed under stools. Coffee moved from pot to mug with the moral seriousness of medicine. The town had come in from the cold wearing red noses, wet cuffs, and the shared relief of surviving one more Vermont night. Then Malcolm opened the door. He was in his mid-50s, handsome in the polished way of a man who had learned that presentation could become a kind of authority. His charcoal gray wool coat hung clean and expensive over a cream turtleneck. His dark blonde hair, silvered neatly at the temples, looked arranged rather than combed. Snow touched his shoulders but did not seem to cling to him. Even the weather appeared to understand boundaries around Malcolm Strayhorn. "June," he said warmly, removing his gloves. "Put the road crew's breakfast on my account, would you? Least we can do after last night." A few men at the corner table lifted their mugs. One called thanks. Another said Malcolm was a saint, and Malcolm lowered his head with the practiced embarrassment of a man accepting praise he had walked in prepared to receive. Ethan watched from the last stool at the counter. Vesper lay beneath him, still thin, but cleaner now, her yellow and black coat brushed, her bent left ear resting sideways in the warmth from the floor vent. She had eaten that morning without needing coaxing. She had slept, too, for several hours by the stove. That should have pleased Ethan. Instead, it made the thing ahead of him feel heavier. Rest made a creature look less like an emergency and more like a promise. Malcolm noticed him after accepting coffee. The smile did not change. Only the eyes adjusted. "Ethan Crowley," Malcolm said. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure in a while." "No," Ethan said. June Bellows, behind the counter, found sudden purpose in wiping a clean mug. Malcolm crossed the room with a friendly ease that made people unconsciously shift to give him space. He glanced down at Vesper. "Beautiful dog," he said. "Poor thing looks like she's had a hard winter." Vesper lifted her head. She did not growl. She did not retreat. She simply looked at him, amber eyes steady, as if measuring the distance between a warm voice and a cold hand. "Found her near County 9, Ethan said. "Ah." Malcolm's face arranged itself into concern. "Strays are becoming a problem around the older properties. People mean well feeding them, but it complicates safety." The word landed softly. Safety. Ethan stirred his coffee once, though he took it black. Alder Cottages safe now? The diner quieted by degrees, not all at once. Forks slowed. Someone stopped laughing in the middle of a sentence and let the rest of it die politely. Malcolm placed one hand over his mug, not defensively, gently, like a man about to explain something to a room full of reasonable citizens. "The cottages are under review," he said. "Old heating systems, old insulation, old wiring in some sections. Nobody wants an accident during a cold snap." "Temporary relocation," Ethan said. "Exactly." "Temporary has gotten long." A road worker shifted at the corner table. June looked at Ethan with a warning in her eyes. Not fear of Malcolm alone, fear of a town conversation turning into a town wound. Malcolm gave a small sigh, patient and sad. "I understand the emotion. Truly. Those cottages mean a great deal to people. But sentiment cannot be allowed to override liability. Or common sense." There it was, the blade wrapped in wool. Ethan looked at him. "Common sense usually leaves footprints. I didn't see workers, no trucks, no material." Malcolm's smile thinned just enough to become real. "You entered a closed property?" "I stood outside dark windows." "Then you know how serious the situation looks." "No," Ethan said. "I know how empty it looks." The diner held its breath. Malcolm's eyes stayed mild, but something behind them cooled. "Ethan, I respect your service. I respect your desire to help, but these matters are complicated. Elder care, building code, winter compliance, insurance. It isn't a fence post that needs straightening." A small, appreciative chuckle came from one of the tables. Not cruel, relieved. People liked a sentence that put trouble back into a box. Vesper rose under the stool. Her body was still recovering, but the motion was smooth enough to draw attention. She stepped out from beneath Ethan and moved not toward Malcolm, but toward the corner table where two older women had been sharing toast. One of them, a thin woman in a purple coat, froze with her fork halfway lifted. "Is that?" the woman whispered. Vesper went to her and placed her muzzle against the woman's knee. The woman's face crumpled before she could save it. "Oh, lady," she breathed. The room changed again, this time not because of accusation, because recognition had walked across the floor on 4 paws and chosen a witness no one had prepared. Malcolm looked down at the dog, then at the woman, and for the first time his expression had to work. The woman put her trembling hand on Vesper's head. "She used to sleep by my heater. Cottage, too, every Tuesday after groceries." "I thought you were staying at Holloway Lodge, Mrs. Cafferty," June said softly. "I am." Mrs. Cafferty tried to straighten. Pride made a brave but wobbly appearance. "It's very nice." Vesper remained against her knee. The woman's eyes filled. "It smells like bleach," she said, "and the bed's too high, but it's very nice." No one knew what to do with that. Malcolm recovered first. Men like him always did. "Mrs. Cafferty, if there are issues with the accommodations, you should have contacted my office." I didn't want to complain. "Of course not, but we can't correct what we don't know." Ethan looked around the diner. There it was again, the burden placed gently back on the person already carrying too much. After that morning, Ethan stopped asking only in public. He began visiting. Not dramatically, no march, no speeches. He took the addresses Theo gave him, added 2 from June after she pretended she was not giving them, and drove the frozen roads with Vesper beside him. Mrs. Cafferty's room at Holloway Lodge was warm enough technically. The heater rattled like a jar of nails. Her medicine bottles stood on the nightstand in a formation too careful to be casual. She said she was fined 6 times before Vesper lay exactly where the cottage floor vent used to be, beside her feet. On the 7th attempt, Mrs. Cafferty stopped pretending. "I miss my window," she said. "That sounds foolish, but the light came in sideways at 3, right across my husband's chair. I used to know the hour by it." At another house, Ethan met Arthur Bell, a retired carpenter with square hands and knees that had resigned from cooperation. He was sleeping in his nephew's den because the guest room upstairs might as well have been on a mountain. He laughed when Vesper limped in. "Well, if it isn't the inspector." Vesper put her nose under his palm. Arthur looked away toward the television, which was off. "I didn't think I'd miss claws on floorboards. Funny what becomes music when it's gone." Later, at a low apartment near the edge of town, Ethan found Lorraine Sutter, who had played mandolin at church suppers until arthritis made her fingers choose shorter songs. She had sold the mandolin to cover moving costs no one had clearly explained. The apartment was clean, but boxes remained stacked against the wall because she did not know if unpacking meant surrender. Vesper rested beside the boxes. Lorraine watched her for a long time. She remembers where everyone belongs. Ethan wrote that down without meaning to. By the time he returned to Elsie's cousin's house that evening, his notebook was no longer filled with repairs. It held names, rooms, dates, phrases. Bed too high. Heater rattles. Medication moved. No return date. Storage fee mentioned. Contractor pending. Temporary. Temporary had become a kingdom where no one aged safely. Elsie received the news in her chair near the window, Vesper at her feet. Ruth Ann had brought a plate of toast no one was eating. Theo Larkin arrived soon after, with snow on his cap and his old ticket punch in his pocket, claiming he had come only because bad information required adult supervision. They needed records. That meant Marin Pike. The town office sat behind the library in a brick building with drafty windows and radiators that clanged whenever silence grew too comfortable. Marin Pike worked at the second desk from the front, where file cabinets lined the wall behind her like gray, upright judges. She was 46, neat in a dark plum turtleneck and gray cardigan, with brown hair clipped at the back and thin-framed glasses she pushed up even when they had not slipped. When Ethan entered with Theo and Elsie's cloth bag of copied notices, Marin looked as if she had been expecting them and dreading that expectation. "I can't give out private files," she said before Ethan spoke. Theo removed his cap. "Morning to you too, Marin." "It's afternoon." "Then I'm early for tomorrow." She did not smile. Almost, but no. Ethan set the copied notice on her desk. "I need to know who filed this inspection report." Marin looked at the paper but did not touch it. "If you have questions about Alder Cottages, you need to contact Strayhorn Property Management." "Did they file it with the town?" Her fingers moved toward the page, then stopped. "Marin," Theo said gently, "folks are scattered all over the county." "I know that. Knowing and checking are cousins, not twins." Her mouth tightened. She looked toward the front counter, where no one waited. Then she stood and pulled the notice closer. Ethan watched her face as she read. Not shock. Something more complicated. Recognition with guilt underneath it. "I saw the company name," she said quietly. Ethan said nothing. Marin pushed her glasses up. "Northline Thermal Compliance. I remember because the seal looked wrong." "Wrong how?" "The formatting. The old reports from them used blue certification marks. This one is black and white. I thought maybe they updated their system." "But you wondered?" She looked at him then, and there was anger in her eyes, not at him alone, at herself for being seen. "I process hundreds of pages a week. Permits, tax notices, event requests, plow reimbursements, septic forms, senior transport vouchers. If I stopped at every odd-looking letterhead, nothing would move." "Something moved," Ethan said. "People." The words struck harder than he intended. Marin sat back down. For a moment, the only sound was the radiator knocking in the corner. It sounded like an old fist against a locked door. "I told myself it was not my responsibility," she said. Theo's face softened. "That sentence has ruined more towns than bad weather." Marin closed her eyes briefly. Then she turned to her computer. "I can check business registry status, public records only." "That's all I'm asking," Ethan said. "No," she replied, typing. "It isn't, but it's where we'll start." The search took less than 3 minutes. Northline Thermal Compliance had dissolved 11 months earlier. Marin stared at the screen. Theo let out a low whistle. That seems inconvenient for a company inspecting furnaces last month. Marin printed the page with hands that had become very steady. One dissolved company doesn't prove the whole report is false, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. No, Ethan agreed. It proves someone hoped nobody would check. They checked more. Permit attachments, inspection dates, contractor references. The signature on Malcolm's notice matched a name from an older Northline report, but the image looked scanned. Identical pressure marks, identical slight tilt on the final letter. Marin found 2 versions of the same signature from prior years, one attached to a church boiler inspection, one to a library furnace replacement. The new report had borrowed the old man's name like a coat from a closet. The actual heating issues at Alder Cottages were not imaginary. That mattered. Pipe corrosion, aging valves, 2 units requiring replacement, enough to need repair, not enough, according to older maintenance notes, to empty every cottage under emergency order. Then Marin found the relocation addendum. She went very still. What? Ethan asked. It was filed after the residents left. Read it. Her throat moved. Temporary accommodations provided as courtesy. Long-term reoccupation contingent on completion of safety review, cost assessment, storage reimbursement, and approval of revised property use where applicable. Theo took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, though they were not dirty. Say that in human. Marin looked sick. If repairs are deemed too expensive or the property use changes, they may not guarantee residents can return to the same units, and they can bill storage or maintenance fees before releasing certain belongings. Ethan thought of Elsie's quilts inside Cottage 6, Mrs. Cafferty's light at 3 o'clock, Arthur's floorboards, Lorraine's unsold boxes, Vesper's paw tracks in the snow. He looked at the file cabinets behind Marin. Not weapons. Not fences, not guards, just paper. Rows and rows of it. A machine did not need teeth if it had signatures. Marin printed everything she legally could and placed the pages into a folder. Her face had lost color, but not resolve. I can't accuse Malcolm from this desk, she said. No one asked you to. Her eyes lifted. Yes, you did, just not in words. Ethan accepted that. Then don't accuse him. Help make it harder for everyone to keep pretending. Marin slid the folder toward him. That, she said, I can do. By dusk, Ethan returned to the cabin with Vesper asleep beside him, the folder on the seat between them like a sleeping animal of another kind. At home, he spread the documents across his kitchen table. The fire burned low. Outside, snow tapped against the windows with soft fingers. He had spent years believing cruelty announced itself. A slammed door, a raised hand, a rifle crack, an order given too late. But this was quieter. A dissolved company, a reused signature, a delayed inspection, a storage fee, a conditional return, not a single blow. 1,000 small weights placed carefully on old shoulders until standing became too exhausting. Vesper woke and came to the table. She sniffed the papers, then rested her chin against Ethan's boot. He looked down at her bent ear, the amber eyes half-lidded with fatigue. You weren't guarding secrets, he said softly. Her tail moved once. You were guarding people. The fire shifted in the stove. Ethan touched the brass music note charm on his keyring, feeling the worn edge Maribel's fingers had once held. For years he had thought silence kept the dead safe from the clumsy hands of the living. Now he wondered if silence had only made him easier to step around. He looked at the folder again. This was not a clean fight. No enemy line. No single door to breach. Just a town, a set of documents, and people who had been taught to call displacement temporary because temporary sounded kinder than gone. Ethan took out his notebook and wrote at the top of a clean page, "Who benefits if they get too tired to come home?" Then he underlined it once. Not hard. Enough. The storm arrived without drama at first. It began as a fine white dust moving sideways across Alder Run, soft enough that people kept telling one another it would pass by supper. By 4 o'clock, the sky had lowered itself over the town like a wool blanket soaked in ice. By 5, County 9 was a white scar between dark maples. By 6, the wind had found every loose shutter, every old gutter, every thin place in every house, and begun playing them like instruments. Ethan stood in his kitchen with the radio on low, listening to road closures and transformer warnings while Vesper slept near the stove. The folder from Marin Pike lay open on the table. Beside it sat Elsie's copied notice, Theo's list of former bus riders, and Ethan's notebook, now thick with names that had become harder to think of as notes and easier to think of as people. Then the call came from June Bellows. "Holloway Lodge lost heat on the west wing," she said, without greeting. The wind behind her voice made the phone crackle. "Mrs. Cafferty's there, 2 others from Alder Cottages, too. Reverend Shaw's opening the church basement." Ethan was already reaching for his coat. "How many?" "Enough." That was June's way of saying too many. Vesper lifted her head before he touched the door. "No," Ethan said. The dog stood. "Of course," he muttered. "Democracy has failed in this cabin." By the time Ethan reached Elsie's temporary address, snow was moving thick enough to swallow headlights. Ruth Ann met him at the door with Elsie's coat in one hand and Panic in the other. Elsie herself was in the front room, buttoning her cardigan as if going to war against poor tailoring. "You should stay here," Ruth Ann said. Elsie gave her a look. "My friends are in a church basement during a blizzard, and you expect me to remain here admiring ceramic birds? You just got out of the hospital." And yet I continue to object to foolishness with excellent lung capacity. Ethan took the small bag Ruth Ann had packed, then noticed the larger cloth bundle by Elsie's chair. "No," he said. Elsie's pale eyes narrowed. "That tone may work on snowdrifts and dogs. Those quilts are heavy. They are warmer than your opinion." Vesper walked to the bundle and placed one paw on it. Ethan looked at the dog. "You're not helping." Elsie smiled thinly. "She has taste." In the end, Ethan carried the quilts. The Church of St. Bridget stood on a rise above the town green, an old white building with a steeple that disappeared into the weather. Its windows glowed amber against the blue storm, and the front doors had been propped open with sandbags while people came in stamping snow from their boots. The bell did not ring. It did not need to. Light was enough invitation. Inside, the church smelled of wet wool, candle wax, old hymnals, and coffee that had been made in a percolator old enough to have opinions about sin. Folding cots lined the fellowship hall below the sanctuary. Blankets were stacked on tables. Someone had brought soup in 2 dented stockpots. A road crewman was trying to coax a portable heater into life, while 3 elderly women gave advice he had not requested. Reverend Alden Shaw moved through the room in a black clerical shirt under a heavy brown cardigan, his white hair flattened by snow, his long face drawn but steady. He was 72 and built like a man whom time had narrowed but not emptied. He carried a clipboard in one hand and a stack of towels in the other, looking less like a saint than a tired innkeeper on the night Bethlehem overbooked. "Ethan," he said when he saw him. His eyes flicked to Elsie, then to Vesper. "Thank God." Elsie lifted her chin. "He may accept partial credit." Alden almost smiled, then helped her to a chair near the wall. Vesper stayed close, her shoulder brushing Elsie's knee. People noticed. Mrs. Cafferty was there, wrapped in a purple coat, hands cupped around tea. Arthur Bell sat with his bad knees stretched toward a heater that was losing its argument with physics. Lorraine Sutter had a scarf over her hair and a cardboard box beside her feet. Others Ethan knew now by name or by notebook page. Paul Riven from Cottage 5, Dana Hollis from Cottage 3, Miriam Vale from Cottage 8. Some had come from the lodge, some from relatives' houses without power, some from temporary rooms too far from the center of town to feel safe when the roads closed. They did not look like a rescued group. They looked like a misplaced neighborhood. Theo Larkin arrived half an hour later, driving an old church van that coughed like a smoker, but refused to die. He came in wearing his faded navy coat and mismatched gloves, snow in his white mustache, declaring that if anyone criticized his driving, they would be invited to walk home and apologize to gravity. Behind him came 2 more former Alder residents and a box of donated flashlights. Marin Pike arrived last, clutching a waterproof folder beneath her coat. Her hair had escaped its clip, and melted snow dotted her glasses. She looked smaller than she had behind the desk at Town Hall, but there was something harder in her posture now. Fear had not left her. It had simply stopped being in charge. Ethan saw the folder and gave a slight nod. She nodded back. That small exchange carried more than either of them would have said aloud. The papers had made it to the room. The room had filled with the people the papers had tried to flatten. For a while, the storm gave everyone work enough to avoid truth. Chairs had to be moved, soup served, batteries found, wet socks exchanged for dry ones from a donation bin. Ethan carried cots, shifted tables, checked the west door where wind pushed snow under the crack. Vesper moved among the residents with a quiet purpose, stopping at one chair, then another, letting hands find her head, her back, her bent ear. No one called her a stray. Not once. That was when Malcolm Strayhorn arrived. He entered through the side door with 2 men carrying boxes behind him. Coffee urns, bread, packaged pastries, a few new space heaters still in their cardboard sleeves. His charcoal coat was dusted white at the shoulders, his hair damp but still arranged into dignity. The room, already trained by habit, made space for him. "Reverend," Malcolm called warmly, "I heard you opened up. I brought what I could." Alden Shaw walked toward him. "Thank you, Malcolm." The words came automatically. Ethan heard the moment after them, the slight pause in which Alden seemed to hear himself too. Malcolm did not miss it. Men like him heard hesitation the way dogs heard distant engines. He set a box on the table and turned to the room. "Everyone, please, let's stay calm tonight. The weather has made a difficult situation worse, but no one is being abandoned. The cottages will be addressed properly. Safety takes time." Safety again. The word drifted into the room wearing its clean coat. Mrs. Cafferty looked down at her tea. Arthur Bell stared at the heater. Lorraine touched the empty place in her lap where a mandolin might once have rested. Malcolm continued, voice gentle, reasonable, almost sorrowful. "I know there are rumors. I know displacement is uncomfortable. But speculation can hurt the very people trying to help. We need patience, not suspicion." Ethan felt the old pull in his body. The sharp desire to step forward cut through the fog, forced the room to see the shape behind Malcolm's words. Vesper came to stand beside his boot, not pressing, not asking. Just there. Ethan looked down at her. The shepherd's amber eyes were not on Malcolm. They were on the quilt bundle near Elsie's chair. So Ethan did not raise his voice. He picked up the first quilt. Elsie saw him and understood before anyone else did. She stood slowly, one hand on the back of her chair. Ruth Ann would have told her to sit. Ruth Ann was not there. The room, perhaps wisely, did not try. Ethan carried the quilt to the long table near the soup pots and laid it flat. It was Mrs. Cafferty's. Yellow flowers, faded blue flannel, a strip of brown wool from a coat her husband had worn until the elbows surrendered. Elsie came to the table and opened the hidden pocket along the lining with 2 careful fingers. "This belongs to Helen Cafferty," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the room had become a place where quiet could travel. She removed a folded rent receipt, a prescription list, a small photograph of a man standing beside a tomato plant as if it were a prize horse, a grocery list with cinnamon circled twice. Mrs. Cafferty covered her mouth. Elsie placed each item on the table. "This is not clutter," she said. "This is a life." No one moved. Ethan laid out the second quilt, Arthur Bell's, heavy squares cut from old work shirts. Inside its pocket, a lease addendum, a clinic appointment card, 2 bus tickets, and a pencil stub wrapped in thread because his fingers cramped around thin things. Arthur looked away hard, jaw working. The 3rd quilt belonged to Lorraine Sutter, a dark green piece embroidered at the corner. Inside, a church supper program, a rent agreement, a receipt for moving fees, and a photograph of Lorraine holding her mandolin on the steps of Cottage 7. "Had to sell that," Lorraine said suddenly. Her voice surprised everyone, including herself. Malcolm's expression changed by 1 careful inch. "Mrs. Sutter, if there's been a financial hardship, my office can—" "No," she said. It was not a shout. It was barely firm. But it stopped him. No more offices. Something passed through the room then, not anger exactly. Recognition. People who had been sitting as evacuees began to sit as residents. Elsie kept reading names. Paul Riven, Dana Hollis, Miriam Vale. Cottage numbers, rent receipts, medical lists, letters from nephews, photographs of dogs long gone, gardens buried under snow, birthday candles, church picnics, porches in summer light. None of it looked powerful. That was why it was. The papers Maren had brought stayed in her folder for a while. Ethan saw her fingers tighten around it. She was waiting, perhaps for permission, perhaps for courage. Across the room, Alden Shaw stood near the coffee urns Malcolm had brought, looking at the quilts as if each one had been laid across his own shoulders. Malcolm tried again, softer. "Elsie, no one is denying these are meaningful, but personal items don't change the building code." Elsie looked up. "No, but they do change whether you may speak of homes as if they are storage units with curtains." A few people inhaled sharply. Ethan almost smiled. Alden stepped forward then. He did not go to Malcolm. He went to the table of quilts. For a moment he simply stood there, one hand resting near Mrs. Cafferty's grocery list. His fingers were long and thin, the nails clean, the knuckles reddened by cold. When he spoke, his voice carried the tired weight of a bell that had rung through too many funerals and not enough warnings. "I took the heaters," he said. The room looked at him. Alden did not look away. "Malcolm donated heaters to the church basement. Funds, too. I was grateful. I am still grateful for help given when help was needed." He swallowed. "But gratitude is not discernment. I let one become the other." Malcolm's smile was gone now, though his face remained composed. "Reverend," he said quietly, "this is not the time." Alden turned to him. "It appears to be exactly the time." The fellowship hall went utterly still. Alden looked back at the residents. "A church roof means little if people are still left outside under it." The words did not strike like thunder. They settled like snow on every uncovered thing. Maren opened her folder. Ethan noticed the tremor in her hands. He noticed, too, that she stood anyway. "I need to say something," she said. Her voice was small. The storm pressed against the windows as if trying to hear. "I saw the maintenance report when it came through town office. The company seal looked wrong. I told myself it was probably updated paperwork. I told myself that because it was easier than making a problem." She breathed in, shakily. "I checked. Northline Thermal Compliance dissolved 11 months before that report was filed." Malcolm's head turned very slowly. "Maren," he said, with disappointment so polished it almost looked like concern. She flinched, but she did not sit. "There are also issues with the relocation addendum," she continued. "It was filed after residents had already been moved. It contains language that may affect their ability to return to the same units." People began murmuring now, not loudly, not with certainty. But the spell had cracked, and through the crack came questions. Malcolm lifted both hands slightly. "These matters are being oversimplified. Old properties require flexibility. No one here has been evicted." "No," Arthur Bell said from his chair, "just misplaced until we stopped fitting the shelf." That landed harder than any accusation. Then Vesper moved. She left Elsie's side and walked down the center of the fellowship hall toward the stairs. At first, people thought she was going outside. Ethan took a step after her, worried by her leg, but she did not go far. She climbed only to the landing where the side door stood open beneath the church awning. Cold air swept in, carrying snow. Vesper sat there, facing the road. Not toward Malcolm, not toward the quilts. Toward County 9. For one strange moment, the room watched a thin German shepherd watch the storm. Mrs. Cafferty whispered, "She's counting." Theo removed his cap. Lorraine said, "Hollis isn't here." "Neither is Paul's sister," someone added. "Miriam's neighbor didn't make it from the lodge." Names began to rise. Not as evidence, as absence. The missing became present by being spoken. Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Vesper's narrow back, at the bent ear tilted toward the road. He understood then that she had not stopped waiting because Elsie was found. Elsie had only been one voice in a choir gone scattered. Alden Shaw turned to 2 volunteers near the kitchen. "Make a list of who isn't here. We'll call. We'll send drivers when the road crews clear a lane. No one from Alder Cottages spends this storm unaccounted for." The room moved, quietly at first, then with purpose. June, who had arrived sometime during Elsie's reading with a tray of sandwiches and murder in her eyes for anyone who refused food, began assigning names to people with phones. Theo started drawing road routes on the back of a church bulletin. Marin gave her folder to Alden and asked for a pen. Mrs. Cafferty, still wrapped in purple, said she remembered who took medication at supper and who would pretend not to need help. Malcolm stood beside his donated coffee, watching the room leave him without walking away. That, Ethan thought, was the first real defeat Malcolm had suffered. Not exposure, irrelevance. The storm continued outside. The church lights flickered once, then held. In the fellowship hall, the quilts lay open on the long table, their pockets emptied, their ordinary treasures visible under fluorescent light and candle glow. Ethan climbed the few steps to Vesper and crouched beside her. "You still waiting?" he asked. The shepherd did not look at him. But her tail moved once against the cold floor. Behind them, voices called names into the storm. Not loudly, not heroically, faithfully. Ethan rested one hand on the doorframe and looked out toward the road hidden under snow. For the first time in years, a building full of people stood behind him. And this time, he did not step away. By morning, the storm had left Alder Run glittering and suspiciously innocent. Snow clung to the church roof, softened the stone steps, and filled the ruts along County 9. The sky above town was pale blue, almost gentle, as if the night before had been a misunderstanding. But inside the fellowship hall, no one mistook the quiet for peace. The quilts were still on the long table. Mrs. Cafferty's grocery list, Arthur Bell's bus tickets, Lorraine Sutter's moving receipt. Names and cottage numbers, ordinary objects arranged beneath the church lights, like small candles against a large dark. Malcolm Strayhorn did not raise his voice that morning. He did not need to. By 8 o'clock, his statement had already begun traveling through town. The residents' concerns were understandable, but incomplete. The documents presented had been taken out of context. The town should avoid emotional decision-making, and Elsie Moran, recently hospitalized, deserved compassion rather than pressure to interpret complex property matters. He did not call Elsie confused. He simply built a room around the word and invited people to stand in it. By noon, someone told June Bellows that Ethan Crowley had gone military over a housing dispute. By 1, a man outside the hardware store said former soldiers sometimes needed causes to keep from unraveling. By 2, Marin Pike found a printed note slipped under the town office door reminding her that clerks were not investigators. None of it was loud. That was the cleverness of it. A loud attack could be answered. A soft one seeped into cracks. Ethan heard most of it from June, who arrived at his cabin with 2 paper bags of soup and the expression of a woman prepared to feed people against their will. Vesper met her at the door and inspected the bags with professional suspicion. "It's soup," June said. "Not a moral failing." Vesper looked unconvinced. Ethan set the bags on the table beside the folders. Who's saying what? June removed her gloves. Malcolm says no one is against the residents. He says everyone's heart is in the right place, but hearts don't pass inspection. That sounds like him. He also says you're emotional. Ethan gave her a flat look. June lifted one brow. I know. I nearly laughed myself into a medical event. He did not smile. The papers on the table had begun to feel like kindling, and some old part of him wanted a match. Malcolm was not just defending himself. He was moving the ground beneath everyone else. Elsie became frail. Marin became overstepping. The residents became sentimental. Ethan became unstable. Vesper, if Malcolm found the right sentence, would become a stray dog people had over-romanticized. Ethan's hand closed around the edge of the table. Vesper, lying beneath it, lifted her head. Then she placed one paw on his boot. Not hard, not dramatic, just wait. He looked down. Her amber eyes held his, steady and tired. She did not need him to frighten anyone. She did not need a soldier. She needed the man who had promised Elsie he would not break in, the man who had learned to sit still long enough for paper to speak. Ethan let go of the table. June noticed, because June noticed most things and stored them for later use. Good, she said. I was hoping not to hide your body in my freezer after you did something noble and stupid. I wasn't going to. Men say that right before becoming weather events. The next 2 days became a lesson in endurance. Ethan had spent much of his younger life training for speed, move before the enemy moved, decide before fear got a vote, act while hesitation was still putting on its boots. This was different. This fight required chairs, pens, photocopies, phone calls, patience so slow it felt like insult. Doctor. Nora Bell examined Vesper at her clinic on the north side of town, a low building that smelled of disinfectant, cedar shavings, and animals trying very hard to be brave. Nora was 50, broad-shouldered, with ash-blonde hair tied low and a face too practical for false comfort. She knelt beside Vesper, offering the back of her hand first, then listening to the dog's chest with a stethoscope warmed between her palms. She's underweight, Nora said. Healing, but not quickly. Old stress response, poor sleep, hypervigilance. Meaning? Meaning she wasn't just hungry, she was separated from a place and people she understood. Nora checked the bent ear, then the scar along Vesper's foreleg. Dogs build maps from scent, routine, voices, footfalls. Break the map, and some of them keep trying to redraw it from memory. So Vesper tolerated the exam with grave disapproval. Nora looked at Ethan. This won't win a legal argument by itself. I know, but it matters. She wrote notes in firm block letters. A community lived there. This dog's body knows that, even if the paperwork forgot. That sentence traveled back with Ethan in the truck and stayed. Marin Pike worked after hours at the town office, not secretly, but quietly. She did not steal files. She did not dramatize her courage. She requested public records, cross-checked permit dates, printed registry confirmations, and wrote a timeline clean enough to withstand unfriendly eyes. Her fear remained visible in small ways. The way she checked the hallway before speaking, the way she pushed her glasses up 3 times in 1 minute, the way she kept saying, "This doesn't prove intent." Theo Larkin helped by doing what he did best, remembering routes. He brought old bus schedules, handwritten rider notes, town budget minutes, and a photograph of the County 9 bus parked outside Alder Cottages, in summer, Vesper sitting proudly near the front tire as if she owned the transit authority. Transport was part of their independence, Theo said, tapping the photo. Cut the route, and you don't evict people. You just make leaving easier than staying. Elsie gave statements from Ruth Ann's front room, wrapped in her gray cardigan with Vesper asleep beside her chair. She signed slowly. Each letter cost effort, but not doubt. When her hand cramped, Ethan reached for the paper. Elsie slapped his knuckles lightly with the back of her pen. "I can sign my own name," she said. "I was moving it closer." Heroism in disguise. Dangerous habit. He moved the paper 2 inches and said nothing. The residents signed too, some neatly, some with shaking lines, some after long pauses, because a signature, once used against you, became a difficult thing to trust again. Ethan drove them where they needed to go. He fixed Mrs. Cafferty's loose cane tip. He replaced a broken latch on Arthur Bell's borrowed room because Arthur hated asking his nephew. He carried Lorraine Sutter's boxes away from a drafty wall and listened while she described the mandolin she had sold without once telling her that she would get it back. Hope, he was learning, should not be handed out like cheap flyers. Reverend Alden Shaw contacted a legal aid group through the diocese. He did not speak of redemption. He made calls, left messages, brewed coffee, and stood near people who were angry with him without asking them to stop. On the 3rd evening, Ethan found himself alone in the church community room, stacking chairs after a planning meeting. Vesper lay near the piano, chin on her paws. The room smelled faintly of hymnals and floor polish. A framed photograph hung near the old bulletin board. Mary Bell? Ethan had avoided looking at it until the room stopped allowing avoidance. The photo showed her at a music afternoon years before, seated at the piano with one hand raised mid-count, smiling at someone out of frame. Behind her, 6 older residents stood holding sheet music. Ethan recognized Elsie, younger and straighter, Mr. Hollis scowling at the page, Mrs. Cafferty laughing. Vesper was in the corner of the photograph, younger, fuller, lying beneath the piano bench. Ethan stepped closer. He had not known she had been there, or maybe he had forgotten, because remembering would have required him to admit how much of Maribel's life had continued in rooms he refused to enter. Alden came in quietly, carrying 2 empty coffee urns. He stopped when he saw Ethan looking at the photo. "She was good with them," the Reverend said. Ethan did not answer. She said music gave people back the parts of themselves illness and age tried to steal. Ethan touched the small brass music note charm on his key ring. She said things like that. She also said your coffee could qualify as an industrial solvent. That sounds like her. For a moment, grief stood between them, not as a wall, but as a third person neither wished to offend. Alden set down the urns. "The town meeting is tomorrow." "I know. Malcolm will be prepared." "So will they." Alden studied him. "You said they, not we." Ethan looked back at the photograph, at Maribel's lifted hand, at Vesper under the piano. Then he picked up another chair. "I'm working on it," he said. The town hall filled early the next night. It was an old wooden building with high windows, a stage no one used except for school concerts, and a heating system that clanged with democratic impatience. Snow boots lined the back wall in damp rows. The smell of wet wool followed people inside. Folding chairs faced the council table where 3 select board members sat with legal pads and grave expressions. Malcolm stood near the front before the meeting began, speaking to small clusters of residents. He wore a navy blazer, gray scarf, and concern polished to a shine. His voice carried just enough for nearby ears. "No one wants to displace anyone permanently," he said, "but Alder Run needs responsible development, jobs, updated infrastructure, real solutions, not nostalgia." Nostalgia? Ethan heard the word and felt Vesper shift beside him. The former cottage residents did not sit scattered this time. Theo had arranged rides. June had bullied people into accepting soup before coming. Alden had opened the church van again. They arrived together and took the first 2 rows. Elsie sat in the center with Vesper at her feet. The quilts lay folded across the front bench, not displayed dramatically, simply present. Like witnesses who had earned chairs. Marin sat behind the council table only because the town clerk had asked her to manage documents. She looked pale. Her folder lay closed under both hands. The meeting opened with procedural language: property use, emergency repairs, proposed redevelopment review, temporary relocation status. Malcolm spoke first. He was excellent. He thanked the church. He thanked the road crews. He thanked the residents for their patience. He spoke of aging buildings, winter liability, economic survival, and the chance to build a restorative retreat that could bring visitors, jobs, and future tax revenue. He did not sound greedy. He sounded reasonable. That was the trouble. Then Theo stood. He spoke about the old bus route, about independence measured not in grand speeches but in weather misses. Cafferty could reach the pharmacy without begging a ride. He held up the summer photograph of the bus at Alder Cottages. This wasn't nostalgia, he said. It was infrastructure with bad upholstery. A laugh moved through the hall, small but alive. Maren stood next. Her hands shook when she opened the folder. Then her voice steadied. She presented the registry status of Northline thermal compliance, the timing of the relocation addendum, the copied signature, the repair notes showing real but limited heating issues. She did not accuse Malcolm of fraud. She did something more dangerous. She made doubt organized. Malcolm interrupted only once. Maren, with respect, clerical records don't capture the full scope of property risk. She looked at him over her glasses. No? That is why I am asking for an independent inspection before any change of use is approved. A murmur moved through the hall. Then Elsie stood. It took time. Arthur offered an arm. She accepted it, not because she was weak, but because dignity did not require rejecting good engineering. She faced Malcolm. No anger sharpened her voice. That made it worse. Mr. Strayhorn, she said, can you name the people you moved? The hall stilled. Malcolm blinked once. Elsie, I understand this is emotional. No? Names? He smiled faintly. I don't have the full roster in front of me. You had it when you sent the vans. His mouth closed. Cottage 2, Elsie said. Helen Cafferty. She needs the afternoon light because it helps her read without headaches. Cottage 4, Arthur Bell. Bad knees. Hates asking for help. Cottage 7, Lorraine Sutter. Sold her mandolin because your temporary arrangement came with costs nobody explained plainly. Malcolm's face had gone still. Elsie lifted one thin hand toward the folded quilts. You moved households, not units. If you do not know the difference, you were never qualified to decide what was safe for us. Ethan felt something in the room turn. Not against Malcolm entirely. People were not that simple. Many still remembered his donations, his storm help, his charming steadiness. But now they were holding those memories beside something else. A town, if it was honest, could hold two truths and still choose which one mattered more. The chair of the select board, a heavy-set woman named Carol Ames, who had been silent most of the night, leaned toward her microphone. Mr. Strayhorn, pending independent review, this board will postpone the redevelopment vote. Malcolm's head turned. Carol, formal address, please. His smile returned, thinner. Madam Chair, a delay could jeopardize financing. So could unresolved documentation irregularities, Carol said. The board will request an independent heating inspection, review relocation procedures, and place a temporary freeze on any change of property use at Alder Cottages. The hall did not erupt. No one cheered. Mrs. Cafferty cried silently into a tissue. Arthur Bell stared at the floor, as if afraid hope might run if looked at directly. Lorraine closed both hands in her lap, fingers moving as if around strings that were no longer there. Ethan felt Vesper lean against his leg. He looked down. The shepherd was watching the front of the room, one ear high, one bent, her body tired but upright. Not triumphant, watchful. Malcolm gathered his papers with care. He did not storm out. That would have given people permission to call him beaten. Instead, he nodded to the council, thanked them for their responsibility, and promised full cooperation. As he passed Ethan, he paused. You think you've helped them, Malcolm said quietly. Ethan looked at him. I think they helped themselves. For the first time, Malcolm had no immediate answer. He walked away into the snowy night, his coat as clean as ever. But the room behind him no longer belonged to his version of the story. Ethan stayed while chairs scraped back, while people spoke in low voices, while Maren exhaled like she had been holding her breath for days. Elsie sat again, suddenly exhausted. Vesper laid her head across the old woman's shoe. Alden Shaw came to stand beside Ethan. "It wasn't thunder," the Reverend said. "No." "More like ice cracking." Ethan looked at the first row, at the residents gathered together rather than scattered, at the quilts resting across the bench. "Cracks are how rivers start moving again," he said. Alden glanced at him, then smiled. Ethan did not step away. Winter did not end all at once in Alder Run. It loosened its hand slowly. Snow slid from roofs in tired sheets. Icicles along the eaves of the maple lantern began to drip in the afternoons. The road crews stopped wearing the expression of men personally insulted by weather. Maples still stood black against the white hills, but their branches no longer looked like bones. There was a softness in the light now, not warmth exactly, but the rumor of it. The independent inspection came during one of those bright, dripping mornings. 2 men from Burlington arrived with clipboards, heavy boots, and no interest in town gossip. They checked the furnace rooms at Alder Cottages, the old pipes, the valves, the wiring, the vents behind baseboards that had not been cleaned properly since a president with darker hair occupied the White House. Their report was plain. The heating system was old. Several units needed replacement. Some pipes required immediate repair. 2 cottages should not be occupied until specific work was finished, but there had been no reason to empty the entire property under emergency order. No reason to scatter residents across lodges, relatives' spare rooms, and temporary apartments. No reason except the kind that did not like being written down. After that, the rest followed with the slow, grinding dignity of official consequence. The redevelopment proposal was suspended. Malcolm Strayhorn's company faced civil claims, state review, and questions about the dissolved inspection firm whose seal had appeared on the report. His name did not vanish from Alder Run overnight. Men like Malcolm did not disappear simply because truth had arrived. They became careful. They hired lawyers. They issued statements about misunderstanding, process, and disappointment. But something important had been taken from him. Not money first, not land. The story. He could no longer stand in a room and speak of rescue while the rescued sat homeless before him. He could no longer sell warmth without people checking whether the fire was real. Alder Run did not celebrate loudly. No banners were hung. No speeches were made on the town green. The people there were practical enough to distrust applause unless a high school team had earned it. Besides, celebration would have been too easy, and shame had work to do. They had seen the vans. They had heard temporary and accepted it because the word came dressed politely. They had taken Malcolm's coffee, his heaters, his tidy explanations, and let themselves feel grateful enough not to look too closely. So they began to repair things in smaller ways, the kind that did not ask for photographs. Electricians came to Alder Cottages and did the work that should have been done honestly in the first place. Road crews cleared the porches and dug out the walkways. June Bellows sent soup from the maple lantern so often that she threatened to invoice the entire town for emotional labor. Reverend Alden Shaw secured emergency funds through the diocese and then insisted on calling it administrative penance, which made Elsie Moran snort tea into her napkin. Marin Pike rewrote the town's relocation notification procedure with the ferocity of a woman who had discovered how much damage could hide inside passive language. No resident could now be removed under emergency claim without independent verification, clear return terms, and a designated advocate present. Theo Larkin, meanwhile, began haunting town meetings with old bus schedules. He called it advocacy. June called it revenge with mileage. By the second week of March, the Select Board approved a limited community shuttle. 2 days a week, County 9 to the clinic, the grocery, the church, and back through Alder Cottages. It was not grand. The van was old. The budget was thin. Theo claimed the engine had character, which Ethan privately understood to mean it made sounds no machine should make while sober. But it ran. That mattered. Elsie returned to Cottage 6 on a morning when the snow had crusted hard enough to shine. Ethan drove her there because Ruth Ann insisted, and because Elsie insisted even more loudly that she did not require a procession. Naturally, half the town appeared anyway, pretending to have errands nearby. Vesper rode in Ethan's truck with her muzzle against the window. She had filled out a little. Not much. Enough that her ribs no longer seemed to count themselves. Her black and gold coat had regained a rough shine after Dr. Nora Bell's food plan, though Nora warned everyone that love did not replace protein, no matter how poetically they discussed it. Vesper still favored one leg when tired. Her left ear still bent at the tip. Her eyes still missed very little. When Ethan opened the truck door, she jumped down before he could help. "Show off," he said. Vesper ignored him with queenly focus. Elsie stood at the gate, one gloved hand on Theo's arm. Her gray cardigan was buttoned beneath a dark green coat, and the silver needle brooch on her collar caught the morning light. For a moment, she did not move. Cottage 6 waited ahead. Pale blue, repaired window latch, porch swept. A new handrail Theo had installed while claiming he had merely leaned lumber against the steps, and it organized itself. Elsie's mouth trembled once, then she lifted her chin. "Well, I hope the house has reflected on its behavior." Ethan unlocked the door. Vesper entered first. She moved room to room with a seriousness that silenced everyone behind her. Nose to the baseboards, nose to the chair by the window, nose to the sewing table. She paused at the spot where the wicker basket had been overturned weeks before. It had been set upright now, filled with folded cloth. Finally, she crossed to the patch of sunlight on the floor beside Elsie's sewing chair. She turned in a circle once and lay down. Elsie put a hand to her mouth. No one said welcome home. The dog had already done it. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of dust, lemon soap, old wood, and the first brave attempt at coffee. Elsie touched her sewing lamp. Her fingers moved over the table edge, the chair back, the windowsill where afternoon light would return at 3. Each small contact looked less like possession than recognition. The quilts came back last, not hidden in linings this time, not treated like contraband. Elsie unfolded a few in the community room later that week and hung them on wooden rails Ethan built along the wall. Mrs. Cafferty's yellow flowers, Arthur's workshirt squares, Lorraine's dark green cloth with the tiny stitched corner. Under each quilt, Marin placed a small card with the resident's name and cottage number, not as museum labels, but as proof that ordinary lives deserved public record. "Memory needs windows," Elsie said, standing with one hand on Vesper's head. "Otherwise it mildews." No one argued. Elsie was dangerous when correct. Ethan began with the bus stop. He told himself it needed structural repairs, which was true. The bench was cracked, the roof leaked. The schedule board had yellowed into uselessness. But truth, he was learning, often had several rooms, and practicality was only the front one. He replaced the bench with solid cedar. He patched the roof, sanded the posts, installed a small battery lantern with a timer, and built a weatherproof box beneath the seat for blankets. Theo provided the new shuttle schedule and stood over Ethan while he mounted it, offering advice so detailed and unnecessary that Ethan threatened to staple him to the sign for accuracy. A shallow water bowl appeared beside the shelter. Nora Bell brought it. "For dogs," she said. "I assumed not for select board members." "Depends on behavior." June donated a small tin marked coffee money, though she warned anyone using it to buy vending machine coffee would be judged in this life and the next. Mrs. Cafferty added a laminated card with phone numbers: church, town office, clinic, shuttle, maple lantern. Vesper watched from beneath the shelter as if supervising restoration of a minor kingdom. When the work was done, the old bus stop no longer looked like a place where waiting went to die. It looked like a promise with a roof. The maintenance room behind the cottages took longer. It had once held broken rakes, old paint cans, a snowblower that had not forgiven the 20th century, and enough dust to suggest the room had been storing spare winters. Ethan meant only to repair the door. Then the floor looked unsafe. Then the shelves needed replacing. Then Theo appeared with lumber. Then Alden Shaw offered a church coffee maker nobody trusted. Then Nora suggested a corner for pets who came with residents on shuttle days. Then Marin said permits were required and looked so stern about it that Ethan surrendered before the battle began. By the end of March, the room had changed. Clean plank floor, 2 sturdy chairs with arms easy to rise from, a low cot with washable blankets, hooks for coats and leashes, a shelf of first aid supplies, a basket of Elsie's mended mittens, a small desk where Morin insisted forms could be filled out without balancing paper on one knee. Near the south-facing window, Ethan built a low wooden platform where an old dog could lie in sunlight without being stepped on by democracy. Elsie made curtains from blue cloth, not the same blue as the scrap Vesper had carried, but close enough that Ethan noticed and said nothing. Alden brought the coffee maker one afternoon and set it on the counter with ceremonial gravity. This machine has served 3 pastors, 7 Christmas bazaars, and 1 youth choir lock-in, he said. Treat it gently. Ethan plugged it in. It made a noise like a tractor confessing. Elsie leaned on her cane and listened. Sounds unwell. It has character, Theo said. That is what people say about objects they cannot afford to replace. The first pot tasted terrible. Ethan said so. Alden looked wounded. That coffee has comforted generations. It may have shortened them, Ethan replied. Elsie sipped from a paper cup, made a face, and said, Ethan, do not be proud. Yours tastes like bolt cleaners searching for God. There was a pause. Then Ethan laughed. Not a breath, not the almost smile that came and fled like a shy animal. He laughed fully, unexpectedly, one hand braced against the counter, gray at his temples catching the afternoon light. The room noticed. No one mocked him for it. No one blessed it aloud. They simply let the sound exist. Vesper lifted her head from the sun platform, considered the humans, and sighed with the patience of a creature who had long suspected they were slow but salvageable. That was the day they named it. The Vesper Room. Not a rescue center, not a memorial, not a project with brochures and smiling photographs. Just a warm room beside Alder Cottages where residents could wait for the shuttle, rest after groceries, drink questionable coffee, mend a button, charge a phone, warm a leash-wet dog, or sit without needing to explain why going home sometimes required a chair halfway there. Ethan painted the sign himself. The letters were plain black on pale wood. The Vesper Room. Elsie inspected it and declared the spacing acceptable, which everyone understood as high praise. Healing, Ethan discovered, did not behave like Victory. Victory had clean edges. Healing wandered. It forgot tools in odd places. It made you replace porch steps so older knees would not suffer. It made you buy a bag of dog food and realize halfway home that you had begun planning tomorrow around a creature who trusted your door. He still missed Maribel. That did not change because cottages reopened or because a dog slept in sunlight. Some evenings he stood in the community room after everyone left and looked at the piano where her photograph now rested nearby. He could almost hear her tapping rhythm with a pencil, telling Mr. Hollis that harmony was not a government plot. The ache remained, but it was no longer sealed in a room with no windows. Elsie remembered Maribel. Theo remembered which seat she took on the old bus when she came home from town with sheet music. Mrs. Cafferty remembered her lemon cookies were too sweet and ate 3 anyway. Alden remembered the song from her memorial. Even Vesper remembered, in whatever way dogs remember the ones who belong to their people. That was the mercy Ethan had resisted. Grief shared did not shrink the dead. It gave them more chairs. The final snow of the season fell lightly, almost politely, on the morning Ethan hung the last sign beside the Vesper Room door. No one waits outside tonight. Elsie stood behind him with her cane, Vesper at her side. It is a little sentimental, Elsie said. You made curtains. Curtains are civilization. Sentiment is what men write on signs when unsupervised. He stepped down from the small ladder. You want it changed? She studied the sign. No, she said. It needs a border. By noon, she had sewn a strip of blue fabric around the wooden frame, because apparently even declarations required hemming. The shuttle came at 3. Theo drove it himself, of course, wearing his faded navy coat and the expression of a man entrusted with national treasure rather than a rattling community van. He pulled up beside the restored bus stop, where the lantern glowed gold beneath the roof. Mrs. Cafferty got out first, carrying a library book and a small paper bag. Arthur Bell followed with a cane and a complaint about the van's suspension. Lorraine stepped down last, holding a borrowed mandolin case. Vesper stood at the edge of the path, tail moving slowly. She did not wait under the bench anymore. She greeted. That was different. Ethan watched her go from person to person, touching hands, accepting names, collecting the living back into their places. Then came a knock at the Vesper room door. Not urgent, not timid, just human. Ethan looked at Vesper. The dog looked back at him, amber eyes calm, left ear bent, head tilted, as if to say that some lessons should not require repeating. He opened the door before the second knock. Outside stood Mrs. Cafferty, holding up the paper bag. "June sent muffins," she said. "She said if you pretend not to want one, I should report you to Elsie." Ethan stepped aside. "Well," he said, "we can't risk that." Mrs. Cafferty entered laughing. Vesper followed her in. Behind them, the restored bus stop glowed in the snowlight, not as a place of waiting now, but as a small, warm threshold between the road and home. Ethan stood in the open doorway a moment longer. The cold touched his face. Inside, voices gathered, chairs scraped. Someone complained about the coffee. Elsie answered with authority. Theo was already defending the van. Vesper settled near the sunlit platform where she could see both the room and the door. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and touched Maribel's brass music note charm. For years, he had thought opening a door meant letting loss back in. Now he understood it differently. Sometimes opening a door was how the living found their way home. Sometimes healing does not arrive as a grand miracle. Sometimes it comes as a warm room, a restored bus stop, an old dog finally able to sleep, and a door opened before someone has to knock twice. Ethan, Vesper, and the people of Alder Run remind us that no one should have to wait outside love, outside home, or outside the memory of those they have lost. And maybe grace begins in the small moments when we stop walking past someone else's loneliness. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, hope, and the quiet ways life leads us back home. May peace find your doorstep tonight, and may you never forget that even after loss, there can still be a light left on for you.